Actions in one day. Let's see how much mental stamina I have. I'm getting over my cold. Okay. 2.3. Universal versus particular pacifism. This distinction has to do with the issue of whether everyone is required to be a pacifist, or whether pacifist can be a moral choice of some particular individuals, the conscientious objector types, the hippies. Full disclosure, my mother was first generation hippie, and I was not allowed to have military toys as a child. The man who raised me, because my father, the teacher, had passed when I was one, was my mother's father, and he actually did work for the military. He was a civil servant at Base Borden, and that's why I grew up in Barrie, a military town, because we moved back to that town because my father, the Toronto teacher, passed. So watch out for lung cancer, folks. But I full disclosure, I had a hippie mother and a military grandfather, civil servant, but he was promoted from the police. So does that make me objective or conflicted? Well, depends on your bias about my bias, but really they should call this article "Those Damn Dirty Hippies," not pacifism. This is related to the question of whether pacifism is a duty for all or whether it is supererogatory. While the distinction between universal and particular pacifism is related to the distinction between absolute and contingent pacifism, it is primarily focused on the question of who is obligated by pacifism. Universalism and thinking about pacifism will hold that if war is wrong, it is wrong for everyone, and thus that soldiers who fight are wrong. That's very different than support the troops, as are those who support the war system that encourages them to fight. Particular pacifists articulate their position as merely personal and do not condemn the war system or soldiers who choose to fight. This distinction itself is already a bit black and white, but okay. Universal pacifism is closely connected with absolute and maximal versions of pacifism. Particular pacifism is related to contingent and minimal pacifisms. That's again the signposting. Not really claims here. One way that this distinction between universal and particular pacifism has been enacted in history is through the idea of vocational pacifism discussed above. They're missing a period there. Vocational pacifism holds that pacifism is a special obligation of a particular vocational service, but that it is not required of all. In this sense, pacifism is a supererogatory obligation. Religious clerics may thus be required to renounce violence, while ordinary members of their congregations may not be so obliged. Particular pacifism is thus connected to contingent pacifism. The moral demand of pacifism may be contingent upon one's social position. This reminds me of how myself, somewhat eccentrically, I've long believed, with a pause until recently, that the education system should be the system, and all other systems should be subordinate to the education system. So that learning rate is the primary measure of spending efficiency of government money, let's say. And so if we learn nothing from a war, that would be one reason not to have it. But more to the point of this paragraph, you might think that only teachers have certain obligations. I spoke to a friend of my wife, I think it was last year, when she said some awful things, and I said, you're a therapist. You should know better than to say something like that to me. And she said, "Oh, you're not my client. I don't have to treat you well." I'm like, it's the same reasons. Like, you're just gonna switch off everything you know and be a shitbag when you're off the clock. So you could also ask about this one. Does it apply only when you're on duty in that special role, right? Do you get to, hang up the priest robes and be like, "Oh, I'm going to go into the pub and have a fight for 20 minutes and come back and put the robes on"? The Templars could kind of do that because they swore off this or that and went off on the Crusades and then probably came back home after if they survived, if they were rich, but they had to give up their money temporarily. I'm sure there are lots of poor people joining those ranks as well, but as they say, when they started, they only had two guys and one horse. This distinction can be understood by considering whether pacifism is morally necessary or whether it is merely morally permitted. course, there's a whole range of things in between there. It could be necessary if ABC, not just necessary. But give them a break here. They're doing the best they can getting the basic positions out. You'll notice, though, in philosophy, there's often a lack of these comparisons. It's like, well, is it A or B? Well, what if we're saying, A is less than B? That's not asserting one and denying the other. Anyway, we'll get into that in other episodes. The universalist answer to this question is, if war and violence are wrong, then pacifism is morally necessary, and those who fight are wrong. That doesn't feel right. I'm sure you probably felt right to fight at some point in your life. But some pacifists, they're missing the S there in this article. I got to send them all these typos. But some pacifists appear to hold that it is not wrong. It is not wrong to fight, or that some persons are permitted to fight, even though the pacifist herself, another typo, may choose or is obliged by some vocational commitment not to fight. A conscientious objector may thus choose not to fight while not condemning those who do. Maybe. A conscientious refusal may be articulated as a personal belief about pacifism that does not apply to others. This is one way pacifists who refuse to fight may avoid the charge that they are traitors who are opposed to their compatriots who fight. They may deny that their refusal has any universal moral significance or application. Eric Reitan has argued that one may adopt a sort of quote-unquote personal pacifism that need not be universally applied. By the way, I'm mainly interested in moral realism. I don't really think of it as morality if it's not universal and real, but obviously it can be universal conditional as opposed to just a bare proposition. But one way of understanding this is to connect it with the idea of tolerance. A personal pacifist may believe that pacifism is the right choice, but she may choose to tolerate others who do not make the same choice. A personal pacifist may also espouse a sort of relativism. See, that's a problem. I'm not a relativist. May also espouse a sort of relativism that holds that a commitment to pacifism is merely a personal commitment that cannot be used to condemn others who make different commitments. And I can barely mask my contempt for that view. Anyway, it's the way I'm reading it. I'm reading like, oh, and some people think this. But that's a bit warlike towards the view, isn't it? At least it's not physical conflict. This idea of particular pacifism is a subtle one, and critics will argue that it is incoherent, especially if it is understood as a sort of relativism. Yeah, because relativism is self-refuting, as covered in the article on relativism. Those who claim that conscientious objectors are traitors may argue that pacifism cannot be a particular or personal choice. Critics of pacifism will argue that pacifism is morally wrong because they think that patriotism or justice requires fighting or at least supporting the war effort. This is one of many reasons that I looked up my rights in high school and stopped standing for the anthem for a while. Although at this point, I can't remember the last time I heard a group of people sing a song well together, so they should make us sing something. Maybe not that. Just make the people sing. 3 notes, you must. Anyway, this objection would hold that if a war is justified, then conscientious objectors are wrong to reject it. Particularists may reply, it's like moral particularism, there's a whole article on that. Particularists may reply by claiming that their rejection of war is a personal choice without universal significance. And we're going to pause and come back here for section 2.4, skeptical and prima facie pacifism. And of course you know what those words mean, right? You would look up anything you don't know, right? See you soon.